Hi, welcome back to another tutorial. Today I will be creating a prototype of a simple inventory and crafting system. So I'm going to start by setting up a few things in my scene. I'm going to have a ground plane, so I have something to build on top of. And I'm going to have a few items on the ground, so I'm going to give the ground a material so that the other items will be visible on top of it, and I won't have just a lot of white objects in the scene. All right, so I have a ground plane, and I'm also going to position my camera so that I can easily see the ground. And I'm going to scale this ground plane up a bit. All right, so now I'm going to put a few things on the ground that are going to be the resources that the player will use to craft things with. So I'm going to start with a sphere, and I'm going to make this be my stone resource. So first of all, I'm going to create a material that is going to be gray in color, because stones are usually gray. I'm also going to turn down the shininess. Maybe make this a little darker. And I'm going to duplicate and scale these spheres to have a little bit more of a stone-like appearance. And this is just going to be for a prototype, so it doesn't really matter what it looks like as long as I can tell it apart from other objects in my scene. Now, since I was just duplicating these spheres, they have each one of them has a collider on it. And so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to remove the collider from all three of these spheres. And I'm going to create an empty game object, which is going to be the parent object for my stone. So I'll go ahead and name this stone. And I'm going to give it a sphere collider. And I'm going to position it so it's in the center of all three of these stones, or all three of these spheres rather. And then I'm going to select all three of these and make them a child of the stone object. So this is going to be the object that represents my stone resource. So now I need a script which will allow me to collect resources. And I'm going to use a generic script for all of my different types of resources. So I'm going to call this collectible so that it's pretty generic. And I'm going to attach my collectible script to this stone object. Now I'm going to be reusing this stone object a lot, so I'm going to make a prefabs folder, and I'm going to turn this stone object into a prefab. So now I can drag multiple of these into the scene. All right, so this will represent my stone objects for the stone type resource. So now I'm going to make a wood object. I'm going to make a cylinder. I'm going to give this a material also. And this is going to be a dark reddish brown for the wood. And so this is just going to represent a log, and I'm going to give it just like a stem sticking up from it. All right, so this will be the wood resource, and I made this this stem child object, so I'm also going to remove the collider from that. And the cylinder, which is the parent object, this is going to be the wood object. And just like I did with the stone, I want to add the collectible script, and then I want to make it a prefab. So then I can drag several of these into the scene. So the third resource I'm going to make for this demo is string or twine. And I don't have a good primitive to use for this, so I'm going to use a cylinder that I'm going to make very, very tall and skinny. So it sort of maybe looks like plant fibers. And this will represent my twine resource. And the reason I'm calling it twine is because we're going to be referring to it in a script, and Unity has a keyword for string already, or C# rather, has a keyword for string, and so I don't want to call it string because that is already a term that's in use. So I'm going to remove the capsule colliders from these, just like I did with the other resources, and I'm going to make an empty object, which will have a sphere collider, which I will put around my twine object. And I don't want this to be too large compared to the visible part of the object. So I will call this twine and select all three of these and make it a child of that. I also want to give this a material, and since I'm considering this to be sort of like plant fibers, I'm going to use a greenish brown material. And let's turn the smoothness down so it's not so shiny. And then just like I did for the other resources, I'm going to add the collectible script, and then I'm going to make it a prefab. So now I have these three different types of resources. I have twine, I have stone, and I have wood. So this will be the basis of our crafting system. So what I want to do now is I'm going to make a inventory script, which is going to handle the actual keeping track of things that I've collected, and also the process of crafting multiple items together. So I'm going to go ahead and open up both of these two scripts, and I'll be editing them in Visual Studio today. So here's my inventory script, and I'll open up my collectible script also. So in the inventory script, what I want to do at the top is I'm going to create a couple of things called enums, or enumerators. And what this is basically it represents a number value so that you can keep track of a list of things, but instead of using actual numbers, you use words so that it's easier to distinguish what each thing represents, rather than using integers to keep track of different things. So my first enum I'm going to name as craftable item. And the way we create an enum is we use curly brackets, and inside of those curly brackets we have each value that we want to enumerate. So I'm going to type in the words that I want to use for my craftable items, which will be things that I am able to craft. and is common for enums to use all caps for these. So I'm going to think about what kinds of items would I want to craft in a simple crafting prototype. So I'm going to use an axe, a pickaxe, and I'm also thinking here about what are the resources that I have available. So then my last one, I'm going to do a slingshot. So these will all make use of the resource items that I've placed in my scene. And we end that with a semicolon. Now I'm going to make a second enum list called resource item. So I have craftable item and I have resource item. And these will be the resources that I created in my scene. So I have one for wood, one for stone, and one for twine. And like I said, I'm using twine instead of string because string is already a keyword. Okay, so I have these 3 different resource items, and I'm going to use this in my collectible script to allow the item in the scene to specify what resource it gives. And this is especially useful if you are going to have different types of items that give the same resource. So you might have chunks of concrete and actual stones and large boulders that the player can whack at, and all of these might give the same resource of stone. So I'm going to create a public, and here I'm going to use inventory dot resource item, and this is going to be public, so it's going to be something that I can set in the scene for each object, or apply it to the prefabs of those objects. So this resource item, I'm going to give it a variable name, resource type. You can name the variable however you want. This is just to keep track of the actual name of the variable that you're using. And then this is the type of variable. So the type of variable is referring to the enum which we created in the inventory script. So now if I go into my scene, if I select one of my collectible objects, I can see that the collectible script now has a drop down. That's one of the really useful things about using enums, is that it allows you to pick things from a drop down list. So for each of my resource types, instead of changing each one individually, I'm going to edit the prefab. So if you hit the over arrow on one of your wood logs, you can edit the prefab and choose which resource type. Wood was the first resource listed, so it is the default for all of them. So it's already correct for wood. So now if I go to edit the stone in the prefab, and I can choose the stone from the drop-down list. Now when I back out, if I select each of the stones, I can see that each one has that resource type applied. So each one was applied for me. So last is the twine. And just like I did with the others, I'm going to hit the over arrow. So I'm editing the prefab, and I'm going to choose twine from the drop-down list and then back out. I'm going to go ahead and save my scene so that if anything goes wrong, I don't lose any of my changes so far. And I'm just working in the sample scene that is the first scene that Unity creates. I'm also going to clean up my project folder just a little bit real quick. So I'm going to make a materials folder, and let's put all of these materials in that folder. And I'm going to make a scripts folder, which I will put both of my scripts in. All right, so back to editing my scripts. So when the user clicks on one of the resources in the scene, what I want to do is I want to update the inventory with that resource collection. So my inventory script, I'm going to have a account value for each of the resources. So I'm going to make public int, and I'm going to do this for each resource type. So I'll have wood, and stone and twine. So this will be an integer value that keeps track of how many of each of those resources I have. So now I can go to my collectible script, and I'm going to add a new function here. I'm actually going to get rid of the start and update functions. I won't need them for this script. The only function I'm going to use here is void on mouse down, which is a function that detects when the user has clicked on that specific object. And the object needs to have a collider in order for this on mouse down to register. So when the user clicks on the object, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the inventory. So I'll use GameObject.findGameObject with tag inventory. I have not yet tagged my inventory object, but I will tag it in just a moment. And then we'll do .getComponent inventory, which is referencing the script attached to that object. And then we're going to reference one of the public variables. So what I want to do is, depending on which resource type I have, I want to either increase the wood, the stone, or the twine by 1. And so I'll use ++ to add 1 to it. So I need to, when I click on the mouse, I need to figure out which resource was collected. So I just typed in wood here for example. But what I actually want to do before I update the count value, what I want to do is check which resource was set in the inspector, in the scene for this. So this public variable I have here, I want to check what is it when this mouse down happens. So for that, we're going to use a switch case statement, and this allows us to switch through a list of generally you use integers for this, but like I said before, a enum is treated as an integer, so you can use it like a number value, even though we're referring to them with names, which is what's really convenient about using enums. So I'm going to do a switch over this variable. So switch resource type. And the way a switch case statement works is you pass it a variable, and then it's going to go through and look at a list of potential cases. What different things could this be? And then it'll make a decision about which thing to do based on what this value is. So it's basically like a sequence of if-else statements, but it's just a little bit more concise and easy to read. So our first case is going to be inventory.resourceitem.stone. So if the resource type that's set in the scene is stone, and we use a regular colon here, not a semicolon, and when you are going through each case, what's important to do is to add a break statement so that when you're done handling this case, it will break out of the switch loop. So I'm just going to go ahead and set up each of my cases first before I decide what to do. So my second case is going to be inventory.resourceitem.wood. And just like I did for the other one, I need to add a break statement. And then we'll do inventory.resourceitem.twine. So now I have my switch case set up, and what I need to do now is use this GameObject.findGameObject with tag in each of these sections, depending on what the resource was. So I'm going to start with the first case, which is stone, and so this goes before the break line, and this will be stone ++. So this is adding 1 value to the stone count. Then we're going to do the same for wood, and this one I already had typed in wood for this thing that I'm copying and pasting. So then we also do twine. So now, regardless of what resource was set in the inspector, this on mouse down will be able to handle it appropriately and pass that information to the inventory. So I need to go ahead and tag the inventory. And I actually haven't created an inventory object yet in my scene. So I have an inventory script, but I need to create an object in the scene that will actually hold this information. So I'm going to create an empty game object. I'm going to name it inventory, and I'm going to attach the inventory script. Now I'm also going to add a tag to my tags list, and it's important that you spell this the same way as you spelled it in your script. And I'll apply that tag to my object. And there's one other thing that I need to put in my collectible script. So in the on mouse down, when we add the resource to our inventory, once we're done with that, we also want to destroy the object that we clicked on. So we don't want to be able to continuously click on the same object and just spam that resource. So I'm going to destroy game object once this switch case has resolved. So this goes on the outside curly bracket after the end of the switch statement. So now we can test that, and I'm going to select the inventory object in my scene so that I can watch these numbers here. And I'm also going to make sure that I have maximize on play turned off. If you turn this on, then you won't actually be able to watch these values. So I'm going to turn this off. Now I'll hit play. And now when I click on each of these objects, I can see the value in the inspector go up for each of those things as I collect them. And I'm also destroying the object from the scene. So I can collect all of these resources, and I can see how many of each of them I have here in the inventory. So probably this is information that the user would like to know. And in order to do that, I'm going to make some UI elements. And I want to actually have icons for these objects in the scene that I can use to see what these, how many of these things I have in my inventory. So I'm going to use my snipping tool, and I'm just going to take a screenshot. This is really useful when you're creating a prototype because you don't really care what it looks like as long as you can tell what it is. So I'm going to save this into my Unity project folder. So let me locate where my Unity project folder is. Save it into my assets folder. You can also just save it to your desktop and drag it into Unity. So this is going to be my Twine image. And I can see now it has showed up in my scene. And I want to switch this from the default texture type to Sprite, 2D, and UI and hit apply. That way I can actually use it as an icon on the screen. So now I want to do that same thing for each of my other resource types. So I'll zoom out a little bit so my log isn't so large. And this will be wood. And then same for the stone object. And I'm going to select both the wood and the stone and set these to Sprite, 2D, and UI. And so now I'm going to put some images across the bottom of my screen to keep track of how many of each of these things that I have collected. So if you're going to have an extensive inventory with a lot of things, you probably want to have a pop-up window for it. But since it's a prototype and I'm only going to have 3 types of resources, I'm just going to keep it simple, and I'm just going to basically have essentially a tool belt across the bottom of my screen that shows me how many of each item I have collected. So I'm going to create a UI image. And this creates a canvas object for us. And my first one, I'm going to use stone. And this is going to really blend in with the scene because I had the same background color in my screenshot. So I also want to add an outline so I can tell that this is an icon. And I also might want to give a color tint so that it is clearly not part of the scene. And I'm going to hit set native size so it will scale to the right aspect ratio, but then I'm going to scale it down. And I'm going to name this stone so I can find it more easily. And then we're going to create, I'm just going to duplicate this a couple of times to use for my other two. So this one will be twine, and I'm going to name this twine. And then this last one will be wood. And then let's name that wood. Now I want to make sure that when I run this that my images stay at the bottom of the screen. So it's really important that you select any of your UI elements and choose where they're being bound to. So I'm going to choose from this drop down. I'm going to bind them to the bottom of the screen. And I'm also going to select my canvas object, and instead of constant pixel size, I'm going to set this to scale with screen size. That way, if I run this in full screen mode, my buttons won't get stuck in the middle of the screen or popped off of the bottom of the screen. So now I have these three icons across the bottom of my screen, and I want to add a number on top of them to show how many of that specific resource I've collected. So I'm going to add a text value, and I'm going to start it off set to 0. I'm going to increase my font size, and I'm going to change my width and height. So I'm going to make this maybe 60 by 60. And then I'm going to set my text alignment to center for the top and the, or for the vertical and horizontal. So I'm going to position this number in sort of the corner of each of my icons. And you can also choose a font color that makes sense so that it's easily readable. You might also want to add an outline to the font or to the text itself. And I'm going to name each of these based on what they are. So this is going to be stone text. And I'll duplicate this, move it over, and this will be twine text. Duplicate one more time, and this will be wood text. So now I'm going to give my inventory script a reference to these numbers so that it can update each of these numbers as I am collecting those objects. So I'm going to go back to my inventory script. And I'm going to make a public text object. And you'll notice that when I start typing in text, it doesn't show up in this list and it gives me the red squiggly line. That's because in order to reference a text component, I have to add at the top using Unity Engine .ui. Now my text turns green, and it is now an actual variable type I can use. So this is going to be public text object for stone text. Same thing for twine text. And one for wood text. Now, this isn't a very efficient solution, but since this is a prototype, all I'm concerned with is being able to test something fairly quickly. So this is not optimized, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in my update function, generally you don't want to do something like this in update because that means you're doing it constantly, and eventually in a larger project this would hurt your frame rate. But like I said, this is just a quick prototype. So in my update function, I'm going to set the stone text dot text value equal to stone, which is the count, how many of that I've collected, and I'm going to use dot to string because stone is an int and I want to cast this as a string value. So then I'm going to do the same thing for my twine text dot text equals twine dot toString, and wood text dot text equals wood dot toString. So this is finding the text object in the scene and updating it based on the total count of those. So I'm going to save that. And then I need to actually select my inventory object and give it the reference to those texts so that it has the text value that it's trying to change. So we're just going to drag those into those slots. And now when I click on each of my items to collect it, I can see that that value is going up in my inventory. So this is my inventory down here. All right, so now we have a functioning inventory system to keeping track of everything that we've collected. So now I want to add crafting to this. So I'm gonna make a craft function in my inventory, and this is going to be a public function. I may want to be able to access this from other scripts or from the scene. And so this is gonna be public void. So normally we use void for functions to mean that it's not returning a value. But for this specific case, I actually want to return a bool. So what my craft function is going to do is it's going to attempt to craft the thing that is passed to it. And in that attempt, it's going to check and see if it has the right resources. So if it does not have the right resources, it's going to fail and it's going to return false for this bool value. So then I will name this function craft, and I'm going to pass it a value, and the value I want to pass is what type of craftable item you're trying to make. So this is going to be my variable type. So that will be craftable item. And I'm going to name this craftable. So this is just the name of my variable. And I get a red squiggly line because I'm not actually returning anything yet. So before I even get into the actual action of crafting, I'm going to make a bool called success. And I'm going to start it equal to false. And then I'm going to, so in the middle here is where I'm actually going to do the action of crafting. And then when I'm done, I will have updated this success variable, and so I can return success. So this will return true or false depending on if my craft action was successful. So now I need to actually figure out how am I going to craft these things. And we're going to use a switch case statement just like we did for the collectible. That way we can check different conditions depending on which craftable item we're trying to make. So this is going to be a switch, and we're going to switch over the craftable variable. And each case we have is going to be one of these three: axe, pickaxe, or slingshot. So first we'll do case craftable item dot axe, and we want to make sure that we break in between each case. Next case will be craftable item dot pickaxe, and break. And then we'll do, oops, this should be a colon, not a semicolon. And then finally we'll do craftable item dot slingshot and break. So now I have my switch case statement set up, and so now I need to figure out what's going to happen inside each of these cases. And so what I want to do is, when I'm attempting to craft something like an axe, I want to think about what resources do I need for this. And so I'm going to have an if statement to check how many of each type of resource I have. So for an axe, I'm going to say I want at least 1 wood, so greater than or equal to 1. And I also want some stone. So I'm going to say stone should be greater than or equal to 2. So in order to craft this item, we need 1 wood and 2 stone. If we have 1 wood and 2 stone, we're going to, first things first, we're going to set the success variable to true. So we did actually craft this. Then we're going to remove the wood that we used to craft and the stone. So we're going to do wood minus equals 1 and stone minus equals 2. We also want a way to keep track of the fact that we have crafted this item. So I'm going to have a couple of variables at the top to know which items I've crafted. For the purposes of this prototype, I'm only going to allow my player to have 1 axe, 1 pickaxe, and 1 slingshot. You may want to have an integer value, keeping track of how many of specific things the player has crafted, but for this specific example, I'm just going to have a Boolean value. So I'm going to make it private. Actually, I'm going to make this public so I can see it in my scene. So we're going to do public bool has axe and public bool has pickaxe. Public bool has slingshot. So in this case where I have crafted the axe, I'm going to set has axe equal to true. Now I'm going to do something very similar for the pickaxe and the slingshot. So first I'm going to check if the player has certain items, and I'm going to look for the pickaxe. I'm going to say they should have at least 2 wood and 3 stone. You can tweak these values for difficulty or for narrative, depending on what's more important to you. So you could either be focused on making sure that things scale properly so that the player is introduced to new things at the pace that you want, or you could think about what narratively makes sense. If you're actually making a pickaxe yourself in the wild somewhere, what items would you need and how many of those items would you need? So I'm just picking values that I think will scale well. So I have fewer resources needed for an axe, and then I have more resources needed when I get to the pickaxe. So if they have those items, we're going to set success equal to true. And we're going to subtract those. So wood minus equals 2 and stone minus equals 3. Then we're going to set has pickaxe equal to true. And the same thing we're going to do for the slingshot. We're going to check if, and for this one I'm going to say wood should be greater than or equal to 2, and twine should be greater than or equal to 4. If these conditions are met, we'll set success equal to true. We'll subtract from our wood, and we'll subtract from our twine. Now, if, and I also want to set has slingshot equal to true. So if it goes into one of these cases and the conditions are not met, it's just going to skip over this whole section. So it's not going to craft this item and it's not going to set success to true. So it will skip over this completely, and when it returns success, it's going to return this initial value, which we gave it was false. So now I have my crafting function set up, and I actually have to call my crafting function. So I'm going to go into my scene and I'm going to create a couple of buttons. So we're going to do UI button. And I'm going to put these buttons over on the left-hand side. And I'm going to bind these to the left-hand side. And my first button is going to be, this is going to be my craft button for the axe. And just so it doesn't take up quite so much space, I'm going to make it not so wide. And now we'll duplicate this. And our second one will be for pickaxe. Duplicate one more time. And the third one will be for slingshot. So these will actually be the buttons that will allow me to craft those craftable items. So I'm going to select all three of these buttons, and I'm going to hit the plus for the on-click section. So this is where I'm going to apply a function. And I'm going to drag the inventory object into this slot, the inventory game object from the scene into this slot. And so now I'll be able to find a function from my inventory list. Normally when you create a public function, you can see it in here, but the function that we made in our inventory script, this craft function, has a variable that it's taking that is not compatible with the buttons. So in order to have a function show up in my button list, what I want to do here is I'm going to make a second public function. This is going to be a public void. I don't need to return any values. And I'm going to call this craft by int. And I'm going to pass it an int value. This will allow me to call this function from a button in the scene. And I'm going to name this int. I'll just name it craft int. And so now this will show up in my scene. And so what I want to do is I want to have this function calling this other function. So what this function is going to do is it's going to say if my craft int, we'll use 1 for wood. So if my craft int is 1, then I'm going to craft craftable item dot, we'll use 1 for axe. So we'll call that. And if our craft int is 2, then we will craft the pickaxe. Else if our craft int is 3, then we will craft the slingshot. And this just makes it, like I said, so that we can call this function from a button in the scene. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go back to one of my buttons in the scene. And now from this no function drop down, I can choose inventory, craft by int, and the axe, I said I was going to use 1. Then I'm going to do the same thing for each of my other craftables. Pickaxe is 2. And then my slingshot will be 3. So now each of my buttons is set up to craft that specific item. Now, one useful thing I have here is, since this is returning a true or false value, I can check to see if this was successful or not. And what I want to do with that information is, if I craft the axe, Since I can only have one of each item, I'm going to remove the axe button when that is returned true. So if craft axe is successful, then I'm going to destroy the axe button. And so I'm going to make some public game objects up here. I'll have axe button and pickaxe button. And slingshot button. So if craft axe returns true, then I'm going to destroy axe button. And then I'm going to do the same thing for each of these other ones. So if my pickaxe returns true, then I'm going to destroy the pickaxe button. And if my slingshot returns true, then I'm going to destroy my slingshot button. So now let's test this out. So I'm going to go to my inventory script, and here's where I'm going to drag each of those buttons in. So axe button, slingshot button, and pickaxe button go into those slots. Make sure you have the correct one. So you might want to double check. This is the axe, pickaxe, and slingshot. You can also name those so that you don't forget which one's which. And now let's test it out. So when I hit the axe button, the pickaxe button, and the slingshot, right now nothing is happening. But when I click on the items, I can see I'm collecting those resources. I'm going to click on my inventory so I can see things that are changing here as well. So I'm going to collect a few of these resources. And now I have 2 stone and 2 wood, and that should be enough to craft an axe. So I can see that it used 2 of my stone and it used 1 of my wood. And now has axe is checked, so it is true, and my axe button is gone. And I don't have enough yet for the slingshot or the pickaxe, so I need to collect a few more items. And that's still not enough for my pickaxe. I actually need to create some more stone in my scene. But I should have enough to craft a slingshot. So I know now that I need to have more stone in my scene in order to be able to craft all of the things that I have. So I'm going to duplicate this stone objects a couple times and test one more time. So now I can craft my pickaxe. Oh no, and now I don't have enough wood to craft my slingshot. So I also need 1 more wood. All right, so that should be enough resources in my scene. Okay, so now I have the ability to craft items from the resources in my inventory, but apart from seeing it show up in my inspector, I don't have a way for the player to actually see what they have crafted. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to make a axe, pickaxe, and slingshot. So I'm just going to create a couple of objects to use to represent those items. So I'm going to start with a cube, and this will be my axe. So I'm going to make this tall and skinny, and I'm going to give it the wood material, and I'm going to do Control D to duplicate, and this will be the axe part. And I'll position this up at the top. Give that part the stone material, and maybe this needs to be a little smaller and skinnier and taller. And I'm going to make this, the axe part, the blade part, a child. And I'm going to remove their box colliders because I don't really need them for what I'm going to do with them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take screenshots of this item just like I did for my resources. And I'm going to use my snipping tool again. And save it to my assets folder. This will be my axe icon. And I'm going to duplicate this so I have a starting point for my pickaxe. And for the pickaxe, I'm going to duplicate the blade part. This way I can tell those two items apart. Once more, I'll use the snipping tool. Save this as pickaxe icon. And then I'm going to make a slingshot. So I'm going to make a new cube. This will also be the wood material. And I'm going to remove the box collider and duplicate. And duplicate again and rotate this the other way. And I'm not too concerned with how it looks. Like I said, this is just a prototype. I'm just trying to make something that is a good indicator of that item. And then I'll make one more cube, which will be this green color, which is sort of the string part of the slingshot. And make that go across. And if I had more time to spend on the art assets, I'd probably want to have the string actually kind of hanging down, which is something I would probably want to actually model. So I'm going to select all of these cubes and make them a child. Oops. Actually, so I'm going to make an empty game object that will hold all of these, because when you make one object a child of another object, it applies its scaling. So I'm going to make an empty game object called slingshot. And I'm just going to select all of these cubes and make them a child of that object. And once again, we'll do the snipping tool to get a screenshot of that. Called slingshot icon. And now what I want to do with all three of these, just because I might want to be able to use them later for this purpose, is I want to position them around the camera. So I'm going to make these child of the camera and set my X, Y, and Z position to 0, 0, 0. And then position them so that they are in front of the camera. And I'm going to turn off shadows for all of these, and I'm going to toggle them open so I'm getting the child objects as well. So I'm going to select all these, and I'm going to deselect just the slingshot since that was an empty game object. For all the rest of them, they should have a mesh renderer, and we can change cast shadows to off. So these do not cast shadows into our scene. And so then for each of these objects, I'm just going to position them in front of the camera and rotate them so that they would sort of make sense as if you're holding that object. If you think about something like Minecraft, where you would have a visible representation of the object that you're holding. And this slingshot ended up larger than the other two, so I'm going to scale that down. And I'm not really going to use these right now. I just wanted to have them available for this since I made them, mainly I was making them for the screenshots. But since I made them, I wanted to have them available to essentially turn these on when the user has a specific item selected. So I'm just going to turn all these off right now. So now I have the icons though that I took the screenshots of, and so what I want to do is put these in my UI elements. So I'm going to go zoom out to my canvas and I'm going to make some images. I'm going to put these on the right hand side and I'm going to anchor them to the right hand side of the screen. And then for each of these images, I'm going to give them one of these icons. And I need to, just like I did before, I need to select these images that I saved and set their texture type to Sprite, 2D, and UI, and hit apply. And now I can put those on the source images. And I probably want to use an outline again to make sure it's clear that this is an icon. And I'm going to name these. So I'll do axe, duplicate it, and name this one pickaxe. Duplicate one more time, and this will be slingshot. And I'm going to select all three of these and just move them all up a bit. I'm also going to go into my scene and I'm just going to move all of my resources more towards the center of the screen. That way they're not behind the icons as much. That way I'll actually be able to click on them and not be having to click behind the icons. I'm going to select all of them at once and just slide them over a bit. And this one here, I'm going to move to the front. There. Okay, so that should work so that I can actually click on all of my resources. So now what I'm going to do is for this axe, pickaxe, and slingshot, I'm going to turn them off by default, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn them on once the user has crafted that item to show that they have access to using it. So when the user crafts those things, so I'm going to do this in my craft by int, before I destroy the button, I'm going to set the image active. So I'm going to once again do some public game objects here. So we'll have axe icon and pickaxe icon and slingshot icon. Then for each of these, when I'm destroying the button, I'm going to set the icon to active. We'll use .setActive, true. Same for the pickaxe. And I realize now that I misspelled pickaxe when I created the game object. So pickaxe icon dot set active, true. And slingshot, slingshot icon dot set active, true. So now when I'm crafting my items, I should be able to see the things that I've made. So first I'm going to collect enough resources to make the slingshot. And I actually forgot to drag my game objects into my public inventory slots. So I'm going to go back and select my inventory, and then here's my public game objects that I'm setting active. So this is where I want to put the icons that are on my screen. So I'll drag each of these into their corresponding slots. And now I should be able to craft these different things. So this is everything I need to craft a slingshot. And so now my slingshot appears here. Select some other things, craft the axe, and craft the pickaxe. So now I have all of the items crafted and have the ability to use them. Now if I wanted to make it so that the user could select which one of these things they have equipped, so this is where I would use the game objects that I made as childs of the camera. And so what I could do is, in my inventory, I could have a new public function. Public, and I call this select tool. And this is, once again, and I need to have void before that. And this is going to be, again, something that I use buttons for in the scene. So I'm going to use ints. That way I can actually call this from a button. And I'll call this tool int. And if my tool int is 1, then what this would be is the axe. And I'm going to need to make some more public game objects. This will be for, so currently I have the buttons, I have the icons, and now I want to have actually the equipable tool. So I'm going to do a public game object axe tool. Same for pickaxe tool and slingshot tool. And so if tool int is 1, we'll set the axe tool to true. And I don't want the user to have more than one tool equipped at a time. So when I set the axe tool to true, I'm also going to set the pickaxe tool to false. And the slingshot tool dot set active false. And I'm gonna copy this if statement because I want to do basically the same thing for if it's 2. Then I'm going to set the axe tool to false and the pickaxe tool to true. And lastly, if it's 3, set axe and pickaxe to false and set slingshot to true. And so what I want to do is I want to go and find my axe, pickaxe, and slingshot icons, and I'm going to give these a button component. That way they can all be clickable buttons. And then I'm going to hit the plus in the on-click section and drag in the inventory game object, just like we did before. And for all 3 of these, the function that I want to call is select tool. And for the axe, I'm going to give it 1. For the pickaxe, I'll give it 2. And for the slingshot, I'll give it 3. And then lastly, I need to supply the game objects for the tools into my inventory public slots. So I'm going to drag the axe, the actual tool, which is a child of my main camera. I didn't name it, but I remember that this one is the axe. The second one I made was the pickaxe, and the third one I did actually name, and that one's the slingshot. So let's test that out. So I'm going to select a few of my resources. Let's craft the axe. Now when I click on the axe, it makes the axe my equipped item. And this is covering up a little bit too much of my screen. So I'm going to position all of my my items that I can equip. I'm going to position them at the bottom so it's sort of more like I'm holding it as an object. So I'm going to turn all of these on for just a second just so that I can see where they are. And I'm going to go back and forth between my scene. I'm going to scale all these down. And maybe rotate them a little bit so that they face out, and position them all the way to the bottom right corner. The slingshot seems like it's offset a little bit from the position of everything else. All right, so now I'm going to turn all these back off. Now they're a little bit more out of the way, which is good. And so I'm going to go ahead and collect some resources, craft my axe. Now when I select my axe, it shows up in the corner as the selected item. Let's go ahead and give my pickaxe. And now I can switch back and forth between which item I have equipped. And now I also have the slingshot to choose from. So now I have all 3 items that are equipable, and I can continue to collect resources. So the next step to go on from this would be to have more difficult resources that you can collect. So an actual tree that's growing, and you need to have the axe in order to cut down the tree and collect the resources for that. Or you might move on to having something like having birds that are flying around and you need to use the slingshot. Maybe you actually need to use a stone equipped to the slingshot, or when you have the slingshot equipped, each time you use it, it actually takes a stone from your inventory that you can fire at birds or small animals or something. So those would be the next steps to build off of this. But what we have here is a basic system for collecting resources into an inventory and then using inventory items to craft equipable tools. And then at the end here, we made it possible to switch which tool we have equipped. So that's the basic system, and this is a simple prototype showing how to do that. I hope you found this useful, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I hope you'll subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.